Welcome to OCR History B, Making of America 1789 to 1900 content videos. This video is for the last theme, which is American Cultures 1877 to 1900. Of our timeline for the Making of America, we have 5 themes throughout the course, and you need to know the dates of these confidently, as the questions will always have the dates attached and your evidence needs to be applicable to the question. On the timeline that you can see, remember you have the presidents in red at the bottom, and you don't need to know all of these, but you should know the names of those who passed key legislation. The first theme, remember, is on why America expanded, what caused this to happen, and this time period has the dates 1783 to 1838. The second time period is the West. Why did people begin to migrate to the far west of America? And the dates for this time period are 1839 to 1860. Period 3 has 2 themes within it, remember, and they are the American Civil War and settlement and conflict on the plains. And you have to know that these themes run alongside one another, and the dates for these are 1861 to 1877. And then the final theme for the Making of America is American Cultures, and the final dates are 1877 to 1900. Why dates are so important. If you were asked a question on natives and the time period was 1877 to 1900, it's really important that you are not using evidence from previous time periods. We know lots about nomadic tribes that have been mentioned in previous themes, so it's really important now that you look at the evidence that's applicable for our last time period. So first of all, this is where we see the destruction of the buffalo on a huge scale. Railroads had seen the emergence of buffalo hunters, and killing a single buffalo could earn a hunter between $3 and $20 for the cost of just a 25-cent cartridge. By 1880, 16 million kilos of buffalo had been sent east to become fertilizer, and 3 million buffalo had been killed by hunters. So obviously we know that this impacts the lifestyle hugely of the Native Americans, and that would be good evidence to use in the exam. We also referenced reservations in the previous theme, but just a reminder that these were small areas that are fenced in essentially, and the native tribes are given rations to live on. So cattle ranchers fenced in their lands, which stopped the nomadic lifestyle of many of the tribes. Homesteaders were also fencing in their water supplies, which stops the Indians being able to roam freely on their horses. And wild foods such as berries were being picked and sent to large western cities to be canned, reducing the amount of food available for the natives. So lots of these factors are making life very difficult. A lack of water, a lack of land, a lack of berries, all of these are impacting the lives of the Native Americans. Tribes were also being split up, so the US government deliberately split up the tribes when they were confined to reservations. For example, the Sioux were divided over 5 reservations, and the aim in this really is to weaken that community spirit that was so strong between the tribes, and this is in the hope that it will limit the chance of these tribes revolting against the US government. We also have farming and rations, so reservations force many natives to become farmers. Remember, this is not natural to their tribe. This is not something that they have done as a pastime. So hunting outside of their reservation was banned, and tribes have to rely on growing crops such as squash and corn. These crops often struggle due to the quality of soil on the plains. Remember, we looked at some of the solutions that homesteaders came up with due to the land being such poor quality. So we know that the farming for these native tribes is not going to go well. Many reservation Indians therefore had to rely on beef rations to survive, and we know that quite often the American government just did not provide enough food. We also had forced assimilation. So remember, we've spoken about assimilation before with the 5 civilized tribes in our first theme. So assimilation, remember, means trying to fit in. And this is something that I think lots of you will remember and could be referenced, remember, in our last time period of 1877 to 1900, which were the methods that the US government tried to encourage the natives to assimilate. So, for example, Plains Indians were encouraged to live in houses, not teepees. They were forced to convert to Christianity or face arrest if they didn't. And some children were sent to boarding schools where they were taught English and they were expected to wear Victorian dress. They were also given English-style names, which is a huge difference for the natives and would have removed a large part of their identity. We also saw the Dawes Act in 1887, which offered individual natives 160 acres of land and full citizenship to the United States if they gave up their right to hold land as part of a tribe. Now, as much as this might sound quite positive, the natives held much more land than this collectively, so this wasn't as positive perhaps as it sounds. And by 1900, nearly 2/3 of the land that the natives had held in 1877 had been taken. So we can see huge amounts of land being taken by the US government by the end of our time period. And the desperation really that we can see from the natives comes in the form of something called the ghost dance. So this was where there was a belief by the natives that if they danced and prayed hard enough, a saviour would come and remove the white settlers and fill the plains with buffalo once again, so that they could continue to live nomadically as they had before. So this is the impact that kind of migration to the west had had. And if you are in the last time period, these examples that you can see are all evidence that you could use in a question for a question on the natives, 1877 to 1900. Americans, so Black Americans, we are now going to look at economic, social and political changes during this time period. Economic information will come up in blue, social in purple, and then political in red. So firstly, in terms of economic, African Americans were legally free, however they were trapped in low paid work. A huge number ended up as sharecroppers on plantations, which were owned by former slaveholders. Remember, we've referenced sharecroppers before. These were people who had to give up 2/3 of their crops and give that to the owners. So it's not slavery. Please do not mention slavery during this time period if you have a question 1877 to 1900, because it is not applicable. Remember, we had the amendments to the Constitution that banned slavery, but sharecropping is something that does appear in this time period and is quite similar. There were opportunities in the West. So, for example, the Homestead Act, which had promised 160 acres of land to people who farmed it for 5 years, was open to African Americans as well as women. And somebody called Benjamin Singleton encouraged African Americans to take this opportunity. Those who followed him to Kansas were known as the Exodusters, and 6,000 claimed their own homesteads. So this is a positive economic move for African Americans. Those of us going for 7s, 8s and 9s, again, you would need to know what the Homestead Act was, but you'd also need to know the name, the Exodusters. So please make sure that you are aware of that group who follow Benjamin Singleton to Kansas to claim their right to homesteads. Many African Americans also left the southern states to find work in the industrial north. However, many were unsuccessful. So even if the African Americans were more educated than their white counterparts, the white man was more likely to get the job. And this is due to institutional racism within the North of America. So the North didn't advocate for slavery, but the companies were quite often racist in terms of the people that they employed. We also have Washington, who established schools for African Americans, and he established the National Negro Business League to help support black businesses. So schools and business support helped improve confidence and jobs, and by 1900 America had over 20,000 black teachers and 300 black lawyers. Now there is a bit of a crossover here between social and economic, but I've put it into economic as a result of the amount of money that is being made by African Americans that do take the opportunities that are given to them in terms of setting up businesses and in terms of taking higher level education courses. In terms of social, we have the Jim Crow laws, which I'm sure you will remember. So these were racial segregation laws, and they separated black and white Americans on trains, in theatres and in schools. And in 1896, the Supreme Court declared this legal despite the 14th Amendment. So the Jim Crow laws are something that you could reference in terms of societal changes for African Americans that made life worse for them. We also have black churches. So by 1900 there were 26 black bishops, and black churches were extremely popular and gave African Americans hope. This is quite often the outlet that they use to try and restore really hope and a positive attitude, because life was extremely hard despite all of the progress that had been made in terms of slavery being banned. Living conditions, even in the north, we have racist landlords, which resulted in poor quality housing for African Americans, and conditions were terrible for them. So again, that is something that you could reference. Quite general really, so quite easy to remember that the quality of housing that they were given was of a very low standard. In terms of political changes then, we have Redeemer governments, so southern governments dominated by ex-slaveholders, who introduced laws which limited the rights of African Americans. So they introduced literacy tests, for example, for voting. Now, because of the segregation in the South, with things like the Jim Crow laws, the education that African Americans were given was not of a high quality like it was for white Americans. So these literacy tests for voting were really, really limiting. So Redeemer governments, this idea that they were redeeming the South because they were pro-slavery, although they were obviously slavery has now been banned, they still had a pro-slavery mindset, leads to racist policies being spread by these Redeemer governments. Again, a group that I'm sure you will remember from lessons that you could speak about during this time period are the Ku Klux Klan. So the group had reformed by the 1890s and remained a powerful influence in the South. Lynching, which remember was taking Black Americans and hanging them from trees in public, was far too common for African Americans. And in 1892 alone, 161 African Americans were lynched. Victims were often tortured before being murdered. So the KKK is great evidence to use for a question that centres around African Americans in this time period. And those of us going for 7s, 8s and 9s, again, if you can remember the specific statistic that 161 African Americans were lynched in 1892 alone, that would definitely enhance the quality of your response. And finally, we have constitutional changes. So although the South continued to ignore the rights of African Americans, the amendments to the Constitution did allow African Americans to campaign for equality. So remember, we've seen the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendment, and all of these were positive for African Americans. It allows them the right to campaign for equality, but quite often this is not met. So a question that seems to have become increasingly popular is one that is based on big business and the impact of cities during this time period. And the big business questions are notoriously answered really, really badly. And that is because for some reason, learners tend to use slavery as an example, which is absolutely not big business and it's not applicable to this time period. So we need to be able to reference evidence that is applicable for this time period for big business. I'm going to start with corporations. So corporations were much larger than traditional businesses and were run by a president, not the same kind of president as our political presidents that we've looked at, but by a leader of the business and a board of shareholders rather than a single person or family. So corporations began to dominate American industry, and the example that you would need to know for the exam is Andrew Carnegie, who had the United States Steel Corporation, and that was worth over $1 billion. So great evidence that you could use in the exam. Another example of big business is the cotton and tobacco factories. So cotton mills doubled between 1880 and 1900. Now, I've put here in yellow, no slavery. Yes, we are talking about cotton, but we are not talking about slaves in this time period. There were cotton plantations that were used to produce the cotton, but there is no use of slavery on these plantations. So please, please, please do not speak about that. If you are speaking about cotton, it needs to be the phrase cotton mills that you are using in the exam. The increased production pushed prices down. And we also see by 1904 the American Tobacco Company, who controlled 90% of cigarette and 75% of tobacco production. So they pretty much almost have a monopoly over the tobacco industry within the United States. So great evidence to use in the exam. Jobs in these industries for workers were low skilled and poorly paid, but nonetheless these huge companies were making a fortune. We have fossil fuels and mineral extraction. So there was a growth of factories and railroads led to an increased demand in resources like coal and iron. So therefore we have huge mining operations that begin. And this results, unsurprisingly, in huge ecological damage. So huge areas of forest were cut down and toxic chemicals leaked into the water supplies. So again, if we had a 9-mark question and we were thinking about the consequences of big business, this is something that you could refer to. There were also discoveries of copper, tin, lead and silver when the extraction was happening, and this led to big companies such as Anaconda in the west, and in Montana $1 million of copper and silver were being extracted every month. So this was vital in cables and conductors for big business, but mining of these minerals was very dangerous for workers. Temperatures were above 35 degrees and there were often ground collapses. So again, good evidence there for potentially a 9-mark question. Finally, we have bonanza farms and cattle ranches. So bonanza farms were huge. They were 10,000 acres in size and they employed round about 250 workers who were paid low wages. The bonanza farms made it almost impossible for small farmers to survive. So many small farmers gave up and moved to cities and went into other jobs. So again, if we were thinking about the consequence of big business, bonanza farms kind of result in small farms shutting down. We also had bonanza cattle ranches, so these were able to survive the fall in prices when there was an oversupply of cattle in 1886, and they bought up the smaller ranches. So again, kind of individual farmers here really feeling the pinch as a result of these bigger businesses taking over. Both farming and ranching forced many natives off the land and into reservations, and they used a huge amount of natural resources, for example, water supplies. For the final theme is the growth and the impact of cities. So the impact information will appear in red, but first of all, in terms of growth, we have Chicago. So in 1833, Chicago had 200 inhabitants, but by 1870 it had 300,000, and by 1900 it had over 1.5 million people. So we can clearly see here the huge growth and development of cities during this time period. So cities like Chicago had been growing since the late 18th century, so the 1700s, and in 1870 there had been 14 cities with populations over 100,000. By 1900 there were 38, so again you can see a huge change in the number of people living in cities. Your examples for this: New York, nice and easy that you will remember, and Washington on the East Coast. So in terms of the impact, we have the invention of the elevator and the skyscraper, which leads to an increased demand in iron, steel, coal and copper and other resources. The cities also created many new jobs in construction, but also in manufacturing and transport. So we need to know that there was a demand for these resources as a result of cities expanding. We also have workers or migrants who were living in poorly designed, overcrowded apartments. There was little privacy and sanitation was poor. The death rates of children were far higher in cities than for the population as a whole. So again, if we're talking about the impact of this, we can speak about the impact on workers and the consequences of living in cities that don't have a sufficient infrastructure for the people that are working there. Finally, there were some benefits of living in these new cities. They had theatres, public parks, political rallies, public education, and all of these were seen as desirable. They created more freedom and opportunity, and by 1900, almost 70% of children were attending school. Women too had greater freedoms and began their campaign to be allowed to vote. So we've got 2 negative impacts, 1 positive, and you've got some statistics here about the growth of cities such as Chicago. The last section of the Making of America is mass immigration between 1877 and 1900. So there was a new surge in migration due to the US by 1900 due to the idea of the American dream, which I'm sure you remember from class. So this idea that you can be successful and make lots of money and have lots of freedom and live in this democratic, wonderful country. This is what sums up basically the American dream. So lots and lots of people want this and decide that they are going to travel to the United States. Lower fares on new steam-powered boats also made the journey more affordable for families overseas. And in the 1890s, 600,000 immigrants came from Italy alone. So another good statistic there that you could remember for the exam. Due to the amount of immigrants in the US, the government established their main immigration station at Ellis Island in New York City. So you can visit Ellis Island today. You will probably remember being shown an image of this in class, and this is where immigrants were sorted when they arrived into the United States. However, when the immigrants arrived, their expectations were not necessarily met of this wonderful America that the American dream had promised them. So in some cities, there was anti-immigration violence, and this was mainly due to immigrants being offered lower wages for work, which meant that they were then offered jobs. So white workers often felt like they were being pushed out of jobs. So again, in terms of consequence, if this was a 9-mark question, you could absolutely speak about anti-immigration violence. Immigrants sometimes also faced prejudice because of their different culture and beliefs. So in 1887, the American Protective Association was set up to protect Protestant Americans from the dangers of the Catholic, Jewish and Buddhist immigrants. So obviously this is a racist organisation designed to hold on to what this group of white Americans perceive to be American culture. So obviously prejudice, again, would be another consequence that you could discuss in the exam. And finally, in the 1870s, we have the anti-Chinese riots, which led to many murders and parts of Tacoma in Washington being burnt to the ground. In 1882, the US government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which limited the number of Chinese workers able to enter America. So remember the impact that the Chinese had had on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. That now seems like a distant memory to the US government, and they begin excluding the Chinese from arriving into the US. So again, another consequence there that you could describe. You have a number of past paper questions from the final time period of America, 1877 to 1900, American cultures. Have a go at some of these questions as part of your revision, and use the video on how to answer the exam questions for Making of America to support you as you write. So that concludes the content videos for the Making of America. I hope they've been helpful, and thank you for listening.